Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Bridget Anderson, the President and the CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. Today is the second in our series of business resiliency webinars on navigating COVID-19, and today we are going to be focusing on human resources. In this time of unprecedented uncertainty, we want to ensure that our members and the broader business community can find the answers that they need to their most pressing questions. And through a series of free webinars, experts will provide guidance and answer questions to help companies navigate these very challenging times. We encourage you to take part in today's discussion. You can engage with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by using the hashtag GVBOT. We are also using Slido for today's discussion to allow you to post some questions. You can do this in your internet browser or on your phone by going to slido.com, and the password for today is GVBOTHR. Before we start, and especially in these challenging times, we want to thank our long-standing sponsors called our Pillar Partners. They include TELUS, YBR, CN, BCIT, and Air Canada. We are very grateful for the support of these 5 organizations whose annual partnerships and commitments enable the important work of the Board of Trade. Thank you as well to our preferred media partner, Business in Vancouver. Today, we are joined by Sara Parchello, a partner with Bennett Jones. Sara has an employment and labor-focused legal practice with considerable understanding of the retail, hospitality, manufacturing, and mining industries. She is specialized resource for HR professionals and in-house counsel generalists to consult on employment-related issues, including drafting and enforcing restrictive covenants, human resources policy development, accommodation and disabilities, and advice on workplace harassment complaints and investigations. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to turn things over to you now for an overview. Given how many businesses have been impacted by COVID-19, many have had to shut their doors. Others are trying to find ways to continue operating, but HR issues obviously a big priority for businesses. So I'm going to turn it over to you for a bit of an overview, and maybe we can start the conversation that way. Sara?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I know our law firm definitely appreciates the partnership with your organization. I want to thank everyone who's joining us, who's trying to keep the lights on at their businesses right now. For us and the people at our law firm, it's been nonstop questions and people really trying to make decisions in real time as information is flowing very quickly from each of the provincial governments. We have the federal government that has just announced revisions to the benefit packages that it's going to be offering workers outside of EI that we can speak a bit about afterwards. So things are happening in real time, and it's really important, obviously, that everyone's trying to get the information that they can get, because it's obviously been a lot of confusion and a lot of stress on employers as well as employees as we navigate through these very uncertain times. So I'm just going to make a few very preliminary comments about where we're at, what's happened in the last couple of weeks in British Columbia, and then obviously I'll turn it back over to you, Bridget. So as everyone is aware, the government, the public health emergency was declared on March 17th. The following day, a provincial state of emergency was declared. The province has released ongoing guidance to businesses. Businesses are expected to ensure that they're following this guidance from the province. Businesses are also being asked to follow very closely the Public Health Act. And what this is saying to us is that, things are happening very quickly, and the government's expecting employers to keep up as they are making decisions in real time. We all know that the bars, clubs, and restaurants have been ordered to close. Restaurants are still able to do delivery or takeout. This is where we were at in Ontario until just a few days ago. We have now had a complete, we've had a new order on essential versus non-essential services. We don't know yet if the same thing is going to happen in British Columbia. It's unclear to us. So that's something that everyone's going to have to continue to listen out for. The government has also enacted 2 new leaves under the Employment Standards Act. One is a COVID-related leave. This is very similar to what a lot of the other provinces have enacted. This COVID-19 related leave has about 5 or 6 different ways that someone can avail themselves to an unpaid job protected leave. So there's no time limit on how long someone can take this this job protected leave, but employers cannot ask for medical certificates to ask employees to justify the reasoning for them wanting to take this leave. Employers can still ask for proof that's reasonably sufficient, but we cannot ask for medical certificates. This leave will evaporate once the pandemic is over. The second leave that's been enacted is an illness or injury leave. This is 3 days of unpaid job protected leave for an individual who's suffering from illness or injury. BC was actually one of the only provinces in Canada that previously did not have a personal illness or sick leave, protected leave under the Employment Standards Act. So these 3 days of job protected unpaid leave will continue to exist even past the pandemic period. One of the conditions to an employee being able to avail themselves of that leave is that they must have completed 90 days of service with the employer. No such service-related requirement attaches to the COVID-related leave. So these leaves obviously sit on top of the other leaves that have already existed in the Employment Standards Act, which includes the family responsibility leave that allows for up to 5 days of unpaid leave. There's critical illness or injury leave, which also exists under the Employment Standards Act. Those leaves and the length of time varying depending if an employee is leaving to take care of a child or taking care of an adult, and compassionate care leave. And so these leaves, including the ones that have just been announced by the government, all exist at the same time. So businesses may have a situation or are likely to have situations where someone has to avail themselves to a COVID-related leave because, let's say, their child cannot go to school right now or cannot go to a daycare that's closed. And then if that same employee has a member of their family that becomes ill, and it's not necessarily just a COVID-related illness, that employee will then also be able to take a critical illness, or if it's more serious, a compassionate care leave, which can be substantial lengths of leave. Again, unpaid under the Employment Standards Act, but job protected leave. One of the big questions right now is, can we engage in layoffs? I know a lot of people who are probably taking part in this webinar have probably already engaged in layoffs. There's been in my opinion, some very unhelpful commentary in the media about whether or not an employer can legally engage in layoffs. We know that layoffs exist under the Employment Standards Act of British Columbia, but there's been guidance from the Ministry of Labour of British Columbia that's spoken about that unless there's a provision in your employment contract or that this is a workplace that regularly engages in layoffs, such layoffs may actually trigger a constructive dismissal. And so that's very, very unhelpful for especially small businesses that are struggling to just keep the lights on right now. That provision under the Employment Standards Act does allow for an employer to put their employees off for 13 weeks. But again, I just want to reiterate that this would be one of the pieces that it would be very helpful for the legislature to intervene on behalf of employers to confirm that this does not trigger constructive dismissal. A lot of employers are obviously also talking about whether or not they're going to have to engage in termination. As set forth in this slide, there is a potential exemption to employers having to pay termination pay. So I'm talking about termination pay under the Act, not payments that are in addition to termination pay, that an employer may be exempt from paying them if an employee's contract becomes impossible to perform due to unforeseen circumstances. We have no reason to believe right now that the COVID-related crisis may trigger or allow an employer not to pay termination pay, but those provisions are in the Act. So right now the guidance is that if you are engaging in terminations, you would still have to pay the termination pay, at least under the Employment Standards Act. Employers who are thinking about engaging in large amounts of terminations need to be aware of the mass termination rules, which are generally 50 people at a location that are being terminated within a 2-month period. The rules around mass terminations create longer notice periods under the Employment Standards Act. So things to be aware of. This is my last slide. So, I mean, what we'll be talking a little bit more about today is really what's happening and how far is the floor, so to speak, going to be dropping for employers. And so all the employers must ensure that they're following the provincial guidelines that are being issued. And businesses must start thinking about contingency measures with respect to how they're going to deal with their workforce. So what are the protocols that you're requiring in the workplace around hygiene, social distancing, and then, how are you keeping people out of work that are traveling to other countries and trying to come back? and what are the communications plans with your employees, and being thoughtful about those communications. Also being aware of what your obligations are under the health and safety regulation of British Columbia, making sure that you're taking diligent steps, and as well as I've had quite a few clients now dealing with employees that say that they don't want to come to work because they don't feel safe and engaging in what may be some work refusals. So those are my preliminary comments, Bridget. I welcome any questions from you as well.
Obviously a very complex situation, Sarah. I want to start with those organizations that have had to lay off people. As you mentioned, that's a lot of businesses right now who were forced to do that in the last several days and weeks. And so for them, looking for some clarity from the Employment Standards Act, it really is, unless, there is the provision there that employers can lay off people if the employee agrees and if there is a contract in place, but those aren't necessarily the situations for many businesses. So what are the options available until there is some further guidance from the BC government?
Right. I mean, unfortunately, there's not a lot of things an employer can do other than to communicate a good news, bad news to their employees, which is, the bad news is that we're putting you on a layoff. The good news is, we're hoping that we're going to be able to call you back. There's some guidance that employers may ask their employee to sign an agreement prior to them actually being put on a layoff, that they agree to be put on a layoff. Again, it's the good news, bad news story, which is that, if we can engage in these layoffs, then hopefully we'll be able to retain your employment. I do think for employees who are going to be availing themselves to an argument that they've been constructively dismissed, some of the commentary that's been in the media has been very unhelpful for those employees, and some of that commentary relates to if you've been laid off, you've been effectively and presumptively terminated. I think that guidance is very, very it's very unhelpful, because those employees may think that they have an easy right or remedy to sue their employer. And we all are unsure of obviously what the job market is going to look like. And that employee will also have an obligation to mitigate their damages, which may include having to accept employment back from that employer. I don't think many employers are going to want to continue working with an employee who has received some bad advice, believing that they should trigger a constructive dismissal when they may have a job to come back with. So, as an employer, though, you really have to think about whether or not you're going to engage in the layoff and unilaterally engage in the layoff, or if you're going to start asking your employees for permission to engage in the layoff, because if the employee says no, then you're sort of in a rough spot. So, these are very delicate issues, and I think socializing the idea as part of a broader communications plan with your employees is a really smart idea, so that people don't think, okay, well, I'm having my pay reduced right now. Now my employer's talking about layoffs. I don't know if this is just 1, 2, 3 step out the door. A communications plan that's honest as much as you can be, I think, is very helpful in these circumstances.
That's a great point, Sarah. And I think the other thing for employers to know, that if they haven't yet laid off people and they are considering doing that, to be able to reach out and get some legal advice as well. Now, there are some businesses, certainly those grocery stores and pharmacies and some restaurants that are offering takeout, others that are in the supply chain that are needing to keep businesses open and wanting to keep businesses open. And we did see just a short time ago, a couple of hours ago, we did see some guidance from the BC government around essential services. So I'm just weeding through all of that right now, and there's a very extensive list as they're trying to keep supply chains open and keep people to work as much as possible, but understanding that it's new information and you perhaps haven't seen it yet either. I want to talk about the new businesses, or the businesses rather, that are staying open, and what employers need to do to ensure that they are protecting their employees.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, the guidance is very, very helpful. Obviously, communications are very, very helpful in order to meet your obligations under the health and safety regulations, making sure that you're taking steps that are reasonable in the circumstances. So, all those sorts of actions don't require perfection by an employer, but they certainly require an employer to be diligent in terms of continuing to review the information that's in front of them. Employers, at the same time that they're trying to keep the lights on and try to figure out what's going on, should also be paying attention to some of the other changes that have been announced by the federal government with respect to the new CERB benefit. So, employees that they may have to lay off, there's some comfort now that there's going to be potentially two types of benefits for employees. One would be the CERB, and although we're still trying to figure out and understand how employment insurance is going to interact with that benefit. But for those employers who are continuing to work, it's really important to keep the lines of communication open with their employees and making sure that their employees see that they're providing things to help the employees stay safe, and listening to employee concerns when employees come forward and say, I'm uncomfortable about this particular aspect of my job, what about gloves, what about other protective gear, and really having an open and transparent dialogue with those reasonable requests.
Now, the other group of employees are people like you and me. It looks like we're both working from home, like many, many people across Canada are doing, and that has its own challenges. I'm a working parent, so I have kids at home, and thankfully they're a little older, so I don't have to worry so much about their schooling. I do have to keep an eye on them, though. But for many parents, they're trying to homeschool their kids or entertain their kids. They're trying to juggle conference calls and manage emails and do the work that they need to do to keep their businesses running. So what are some practical tips or some advice that you have as many people are facing this situation?
Yeah, I'm facing that as all my own circumstance. And given how long this might go on for, and that one of the aspects of the new job protected COVID leave is for adults who have to stay at home to care for their children who can't go to school because school is closed or daycare is closed. And so in those types of circumstances, I think everyone's just got to, make sure that there's a little bit more flexibility. I think, managers, supervisors, employers are going to have to stay in touch more regularly, think about how they're going to be communicating with their employees with respect to expectations. But, everyone's going to have to understand that obviously things are a little bit different in this circumstance. I actually find my workday has been somewhat elongated by all of this, and as people are being challenged to try to juggle a variety of different roles and hats that they wear in their lives. But I do think the workday is somewhat becoming a little bit more extensive, and so employers, again, managers, supervisors should try to get their arms wrapped around expectations around working, later hours, working overtime, making sure people don't feel, like they have to be working really hard during this time or they're going to lose their jobs. Trying to maintain, ongoing communication, whether or not that's with groups, meetings with Zoom, reaching out to your employees that may live alone or be somewhat more isolated, and making sure that your employees are aware of all the different resources available to them to assist them in being able to continue to work, as well as what are their health benefits, including employee assistance programs may be available to them. I know, for example, a lot of my clients have not only just employee assistance programs, but they actually have programs that allow parents to engage with counselors about, talking with, about family dynamics. And so employees may want to avail themselves to some of those resources that they may not have prior to this.
Thank you for that. We'll go to Slido in just a minute, but I wanted to touch as well on mental health. I think that everybody, aside from their anxiety and worry they're feeling about their job, there's a lot of anxiety just in their own personal life. And so as an HR, somebody who deals a lot with HR professionals, what can you tell those people and maybe give them some guidance as we're trying to make sure that everybody's mental health and well-being is taken care of during this really challenging time?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I'm really glad that you've asked that question, because I think it's something that when you have your employees around you, you're able to do check-ins, you're able to do a temperature check. And so how do you do that when people are working remotely? So I think making sure that you have, again, a communications plan, whether or not that you have a call with your team every day at the same time, every morning, to run through what everyone's working on. Making sure the first thing that you say when you get on the phone sometimes is, how are you and how is your family? It can be really meaningful to people, because they're still humans after all, and just asking those questions can be really meaningful to people. Again, thinking about transparent communications, but being truthful as well, because you need to maintain some credibility with your employees. So that runs the gamut from, people asking, am I going to lose my job? What's happening to business? And I think most employers can say, we're doing our best in the current circumstance, not over-promising and under-delivering. So if you can refrain from saying things like no one's going to lose their job through this, because you know, you only have so much credibility, and so everything that you are communicating should be thoughtful, should not be knee-jerk, and it should be you know, in line with the guidelines that are being announced, as well as Public Health Agency of Canada has some really good guidance. But so it can be tricky, because on one hand, you know, you've got to be credible in your communications with your employees. At the same time, you cannot make any guarantees to them with respect to the future.
Yeah, very good point. There are many businesses who I think find themselves in a bit of a, I guess, a limbo right now, because they might have been in the process of thinking about doing some restructuring. They might have been dealing with some challenging situations when it comes to specific employees. So as we're going through this crisis, when is the right time to do restructuring? And then those, I guess, the guidance that you would have around some involuntary terminations during this time. So there's two questions really in there together.
Well, I mean, so there's nothing, well, I guess if it relates to only when this is over, I mean, nothing is preventing employers from restructuring right now. So let's just be clear, the unpaid COVID-related leave only relates to people who fall within the certain categories, which I can run through in more detail. So not everybody who's out working right now can avail themselves to COVID-related leave. It really has to do if they're unable to work because they've been diagnosed and are following instructions from a medical health officer. They're in quarantine under the Quarantine Act, various other items. The employer's told them not to come to work. They're providing care to a minor, or they're outside of BC and can't return. So employees who are not on a job protected leave right now, an employer can still go through a restructure, and by restructuring, you know, there may have to involve some termination. So that employers are not being hamstrung from being able to take those actions, notwithstanding that these two leaves have been enacted. So the question really is then, once the pandemic is deemed to be over, there's no right time, and I really think businesses are just going to have to continue to be very careful about who's being selected as part of a restructure. People who've been on one of these job protected leaves, there may automatically be, not unlike someone who's coming back from pregnancy or parental leave, you know, if an employer is only terminating people, or it ends up that only people who've been on some sort of job related leave or job protected leave end up being impacted by the restructure, you're probably going to have a problem with the employment standards under the Employment Standards Act, and you're going to have a problem with human rights. So, so restructures can still happen right now. Be very careful about people that are on the job protected leave, and think about whether or not you would hold off. If right now you have people that you want to terminate, you may hold off those terminations until the person is cleared to return to work. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and I think you brought up an important point that as businesses start to, or as they are navigating these times and the crisis and thinking about what to do with their business, this is a time where lots of businesses are going to go through restructuring. And so there, it is sort of a more of a fluid situation now. They may come out at the end of this, whether that's weeks or months, and decide that they can go back to more of what the business norm is right before this crisis started, or they may decide that they're going to have to restructure their business. There's so many unknowns about that now, so your point is well taken. The next question up here is advice for employees who are worried about being laid off if their company doesn't go back to work soon. The federal and provincial governments have announced a lot of those financial measures to help these individuals, but you know, this maybe speaks more about the level of worry and anxiety out there about people's mental health at this challenging time.
I think quite simply, if there's a possibility that people are going to be laid off, there's not much that an employer can say other than we're doing our best to keep the lights on, we're doing our best to engage in X, Y, Z. Here's what we're doing with our customers. You know, everybody's playing their part, but ultimately, there's no guarantees that we can make. And I think that making any guarantees, even for employers, let's say, who've engaged in a reduced work week, who've engaged in necessarily in perhaps salary cuts, you know, I think it's going to be really, really difficult for them to say, you know, we're hoping this is only going to last for a certain period of time, but we really don't know, and we're going to keep you, we're going to keep in touch with you. I think one of the worst things that an employer can do, quite frankly, is do death by 1,000 cuts. You know, this week we're cutting, you know, this group of people by 10%, and then next week people find out that another group of employees is being impacted. And maybe that's just what has to happen, but this is what I'm talking about, is that I think if you have to make some really significant changes, make them at once, have a communications plan. You may have to revisit it in a few weeks, but avoid as much as you can doing, one cut here and then one cut over here. It's better, if you can, to try to do it all at once so people can have some relief, at least for a short period of time. And again, it helps build that credibility that I was speaking about before with respect to what your plans are.
There was a question just up on the screen that I want to go back to, and what it talked about is getting rehiring those people or having them come back to your organization once the crisis is over. Are there restrictions in place or ones that employers should be aware of if they want to bring those people back on?
No, I mean, so as long as so if you've laid someone off, you only have, in BC, you only have a certain period of time before it converts to a termination. So you only have 13 weeks in a 20-week period. So as long as you're calling people back within that time period, and again, I'm talking about non-unionized environments, then there's no restrictions to calling them back. If it's outside of that time period, you've actually then terminated their employment. You're going to have some financial obligations to that employee under the Employment Standards Act. You and the employee may be able to negotiate whether or not you decide that you're going to bring them back and recognize their prior service. You may be obligated to do that if you haven't paid them out, or if you have actually paid them out, then whether or not you're going to start them up at zero. But there's no, at least under provincial law, there's nothing that would restrict you from bringing them back. Again, though, be careful about picking and choosing who you may be bringing back if there's no clear nexus to the workplace or the reason for it, because you could end up, when we're starting to look at picking and choosing which individuals we're bringing back, can lead to human rights issues.
Thank you for that. And this speaks again about methodology, this question here about what methodology should be used when determining what staff are laid off. And then as businesses come back, how do you determine who should be recalled first if you have multiple people doing a similar job?
Right. This is a really, really tough question because you can imagine, and I'm getting tons of these questions right now, where let's say there's 3 people in a role and the person who has the most experience is the most highly paid person in the role. So, if there's an immediate cash injection needed for the business, there's a desire to terminate or lay off the person who may be the most senior in the group because they have the highest salary. We have to be very, very careful about that because experience can easily be a proxy for age, and next thing you know, you can be into a human rights related issue. So the way that you have to choose people is that you have to have some sort of objective factor that's going to support your reason for selecting someone. So, smaller businesses, this might be tough, but if you have, performance, any performance reviews that you've done more recently, or you have a rule that you apply across the board, then it's much easier to justify a decision. So seniority is a very easy rule to apply, even for a non-unionized workplace, because then you have one rule that you're applying, and it's much easier that way to justify the decision as not being related to age or any other protected grounds. And so you've got to figure out what the criteria are. You have to be very careful about if you're saying that a role has been eliminated, but the duties are being redistributed to other people, looking at who those roles are being redistributed to. So for example, if you have those 3 people doing the same role, you eliminate the person with the longest service because they're the most expensive, but you redistribute their jobs to some other people in the organization. The job may still already exist, and it's going to potentially look like they've been targeted potentially as a proxy for age. Now, obviously, be helpful if the person is not as old as the other 2 people in that group, but need to be very, very careful, and you'll want to, again, be very thoughtful about how you approach these so that as businesses, you're not going to end up on the backside with, human rights complaints.
It'll be very interesting to see how employers are going to navigate this, and again, speaks to the need for legal advice and to ensure that employers are going through all of the resources that are out there. The next question that we have here is a lot of uncertainty around what employers must do in response to protecting employees. We talked a little bit about that, but maybe you can reinforce, especially at a time where we're seeing shortages of things like masks and gloves and hand sanitizer. So what is the employer's obligation to ensure that they have a safe workplace?
Right. Well, so again, every employer should be looking at the guidelines that have been released from the government of BC so that you can understand what your actual obligations are. Under the occupational health and safety regulations, it is a diligence. It's about diligence, and it's about understanding what the risks or the hazards are, and then taking steps that are appropriate in the circumstances, as well as educating your employees with respect to what the hazards are and what you're doing. So again, the standard is not perfection, but it is diligence. I think, again, we have situations where employees may be saying, I don't feel safe coming to work, and not wanting to come to work. But if an employer can engage in a thoughtful discussion with them about the steps that it's taken, engaging with the employee to understand what their concerns are, then I've seen most of these situations resolve, quite frankly, without having to necessarily involve the minister. But yeah, under the health and safety regulations, it's a standard of diligence, and so it's about being aware, and it's also about communicating the steps that you're taking, as well as educating your employees about what the hazards are in your particular workplace.
Maybe we could run through some of the changes that happened this week on the Employment Standards Act here in BC. I've been speaking to a number of people within the government as well, and encouraging some more clarity around especially around the layoff piece, which we've been talking about. But there were some changes that were enacted this week. Can you maybe run through them a little bit more for us?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So, again, it's the addition of the 3 personal illness days that have been added for employees that have had longer than 90 days service. That really, that's sort of a leave that has been cascaded through most other provinces. So again, on the COVID job protected leave, so this is a job protected leave for individuals who fall within the 6 categories that have been enumerated under the legislation. And so, as an employer, if someone has, there's basically 5 categories. So if the person's been told to self-quarantine or under the instructions of a medical officer, then they can avail themselves of this leave, or a nurse or a doctor. Or if they're in self-isolation as part of public health or another order, if the employer has told them to go home because they're worried about the person having traveled internationally or for some other reason, they again can avail themselves of this job protected leave, or if they're caring for their child, or they're traveled outside of BC and they're unable to return to work. Those are all the job protected leaves. So that does not mean that now, because we are in a pandemic, it does not mean that you can't take steps with respect to your other employees. You can still take steps with respect to your other employees. You just got to be careful with that particular group of people. And so if you're about to engage in layoffs, like wide-ranging layoffs, consider whether or not you keep those people on their job protected leave, but advise them of the restructure, and then the layoff becomes effective at the end of the job protected leave, and what kind of communications you're going to have with your employees that are on a job protected leave, because you don't necessarily want them thinking they're coming back to work only to be laid off on the first day they come back.
Sarah, something that we haven't touched on yet is what happens when an employee becomes sick with COVID-19. What is the employer's responsibility to help that person to communicate this to other employees, to communicate to stakeholders, to customers, clients, that kind of thing?
That's a really, really good question. So I think the first thing that I want to say, and before I answer that, is caution, and caution about being thoughtful and careful. I had a situation a couple times actually that have arisen where an employer wanted to send a communication to the employees that one of their coworkers had been diagnosed with COVID-19 or was currently in the hospital with respiratory issues, because that was what they had heard from managers or supervisors, and were on the brink of sending an email out to all the employees, only to find out that the information that they received was not necessarily accurate. So again, encouraging everyone to be really thoughtful about the information they're receiving and not taking any steps until it can be objectively verified. In some cases, you will not be able to objectively verify it. So if you've told your employees, which I think you should, that you're going to advise them if they've been in contact with someone with COVID-19, then you've got to follow through on that. Obviously, no one's naming names, and we have to be very sensitive so that, again, you don't run into privacy issues or human rights related issues. But obviously, if you become aware, if an employee tells you that they have COVID, you tell them to seek medical treatment right away. Make sure the employee does not attend the office, and if they've received a COVID a positive COVID diagnosis, they cannot come back until they've been cleared to do so by a medical professional. So this leave doesn't prevent you from asking for clearance to return to work, just to allow them to avail themselves. So you definitely want to get some clearance from a medical professional, and then you want to know, who the people they've had close contact with in the workplace are, so that you can notify public health, and public health can assist you in any other notifications. And then think about what your communications plan is going to be, and I would be really leaning on public health with this, so that you don't end up with an emergency situation or giving bad information to your workplace. And then you'll have to think about, the regular cleaning, which everyone should be doing anyhow in accordance with the guidelines, but making sure that that you're even being seen to take these extra steps with respect to workplace cleaning and leaving, for example, in your offices everywhere, everyone has Purell and those sorts of things. So those would be the steps that I would recommend. So it's tricky, because you do have to obviously respect someone's privacy and their medical health, but also wanting to make sure that you engage in a responsible communications plan with the workplace, and making sure you're leaning on the government resources. It's not your job to be investigating and advising everybody about potential exposure. However, if you become aware that someone has tested positive or there's concerns, then I do believe that you should be giving your other workers a heads up, and providing them with resources so that they can also contact public health, so they can understand what they should do.
Okay. I want to go to a question here from Danielle. She says that if leaves are already covered in employee benefits, which for many employers and employees that is the case, do they need to add additional time, like an extra 5 days family leave?
So if an employer is already granting 5 or more days of unpaid or 5 or paid leave, no, this isn't in addition to it. This could, if you are already giving that to employees and this is subsumed within that, you just want to make sure in your policies that you say something like this is inclusive of the family leave that is enacted by the government.
Okay, this is, we only have time really for one more question, and I do want to cover this one because we've talked a little bit about mental health and well-being, and people are looking for resources. Do you have any advice about some good websites or good places to go where employers can get some more information about how to support employees' mental and emotional health during this time?
So some of the benefits carriers, even if you don't have benefits plans, have some decent resources that are posted. Organizations like CAMH, which is Canadian Centre for Mental Health, have some excellent resources. I'd be happy to pull together some other resources to send to you that you can provide with your membership, of things where we point to people in directions as well, if that would be helpful.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you. And I would mention that you can find a lot of these links to the information that we're talking about on a resource page at the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. In addition, Sarah, you've got a very good point about how lots of the medical health benefits providers do provide telephone assistance or virtual assistance for employees during this time. Thanks so much, Sarah. Your input and your insight today was really valuable. I know a lot of employers are struggling with these very complex HR situations, so really do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much to you and your team for hosting me, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you and your members.
Thanks, Sarah. And if you've missed anything, you can find this. We are recording these webinars and we're putting them on our website. So just go to GVBOT and you will be able to find this webinar. So we are going to continue these important conversations and we want to stay connected. We are going to be hosting more free webinars on navigating COVID-19 in the coming days. Over the next days and weeks, we'll be bringing together experts to speak on a variety of topics, including accessing government resources and support, mental health, crisis to recovery in the COVID-19 situation, and adaptive leadership. We have also, as I mentioned, created a business resource page designed to provide planning toolkits and information to businesses and individuals in our region, and you'll find that right there at theboardoftrade.com/COVID-19. So this page is going to be updated as new information becomes available, and we'll continue to find and create new resources to help you navigate the situation. Thank you to everyone for being part of today's webinar. We look forward to connecting again soon. And to echo the wise words of Dr. Bonnie Henry, our Provincial Medical Health Officer, be kind, be calm, and be safe.